Wyoming Territory, September 1887, rain slammed the dust flat, and lightning cracked the sky in half when Travis Archer rode hard across the valley. Mud kicked up behind his horse's hooves, soaking his coat and hat, but he did not slow down. The church steeple stood like a ghost in the storm, just beyond the cottonwoods, and he aimed straight for it. He had waited too long. He had let her go once, and he was not about to do it again. The wind howled around him, almost drowning out the sound of the bell tolling in the distance. Not for a wedding. Not anymore. Inside the white clapboard church on the edge of Elk Hollow, Adeline Emery stood alone in front of the altar, rain tapping against the windows and her veil crumpled in her fist. Her wedding dress hung heavy with damp, the lace sleeves clinging to her arms. There were no guests, no preacher, no groom, only silence. She had not cried. Not yet. Her hands trembled, but her chin stayed high. She had promised herself she would not break today. Not again. The door burst open with a bang that echoed down the rafters. Adeline spun around, startled, as Travis stepped inside, water streaming off his hat and coat. His chest rose hard beneath the soaked fabric. He looked like he had ridden straight through hell. "Adeline," he said, voice low, breathless. Her eyes widened. What are you doing here?" He took off his hat slowly, rain dripping from the brim. "I heard," he said, "that he left you." She swallowed hard, jaw tightening. "You heard right." The silence stretched between them, heavy and charged. "I should have come sooner," Travis said, stepping forward. "I should have never let you say yes to him." Adeline's voice cracked. "It was not your place." "I know," he said. "But I never stopped loving you." Her breath caught. Her eyes glistened now, but she blinked fast, refusing to let the tears fall. "Why now, Travis?" she asked. "Why today?" He looked at her like she was the only thing in the world that made sense. "Because I could not stay away. Not when I knew you were standing here alone." She stared at him, the man she had known since they were children running around the edge of the hollow, the man who had left for Kansas when he was 20 and only come back once to bury his father. The man who had written her one letter too few. "I waited for you," she whispered. "I know," he said, taking another step. "And I was a fool, but I am here now. And I am asking you to take my hand." Her eyes filled now, finally, and she let the tears fall. "You are serious?" He reached for her, slow and sure, his fingers brushing hers. "I rode through the storm, Adeline," he said, "because I could not let you walk out of this church alone." She looked down at their hands, then back up at him. "You really want this?" "I want you," he said. "Always have." Her breath came out shaky as she nodded once, then stepped forward and wrapped her arms around his soaked shoulders. He held her close, burying his face in her hair, and for the first time all day she felt warm. Outside, the storm began to ease. The thunder moved farther east, and the rain slowed to a steady whisper. Adeline pulled back just enough to look up at him. "This is not how it was supposed to go." "No," he said, "but maybe it is how it was meant to." She let out a short, wet laugh. "You think the preacher's still around?" "I think he is probably halfway to Cheyenne by now," Travis said, brushing a wet strand of hair from her cheek. Adeline looked around the empty church, her dress ruined, her flowers wilted, but somehow none of it mattered anymore. "What do we do now?" she asked. He smiled, soft and sure. "We ride back to the ranch, and tomorrow we go find a preacher willing to marry us under blue skies." Adeline looked at the man she had loved for half her life and finally nodded. "All right," she said. "Let's go home." The trail back to the Emery Ranch wound through wet fields and over a narrow rise where the prairie opened wide again. The rain had softened to a mist, and the clouds thinned just enough for dusk to color the sky a pale lavender. Travis rode beside Adeline, their horses moving slower now, careful over the slick ground. Her dress, clinging and stained, no longer mattered. She hadn't spoken since they left the church. Not out of hesitation, but something quieter, like she was feeling her way through the moment, not ready to break it with words. It wasn't until they reached the barn that she dismounted and pressed her hand to the gelding's flank, steadying herself before turning. "I'm not sure what Ma will say," she murmured, brushing damp curls off her forehead. Travis stepped beside her, reins in hand. "She'll say she was never fond of Dyer." Adeline's shoulders lifted with a breath that didn't quite turn into a laugh. "She'll say it with her apron off and the porch broom in her hand. That way it'll sting less." He waited as she led the horse into the stall, watching her ease the saddle off with practiced care. Her movements were precise, not hurried. She hung the bridle, took a worn brush from the hook, and began working along the animal's side. "I don't want folks talking," she said finally, not looking up. "They will," he replied, "but they'll talk less if we ride into town married by week's end." She stopped brushing. "That fast? You already had the dress," he said gently. Adeline turned then, her eyes clear in the dim barn light. "It's not the wedding I mind. It's the world that comes after." He stepped forward, close enough to smell the hay and the rain still clinging to her skin. "You think I'll turn to dust once it's done? I think you've never stayed put." He didn't answer right away. The loft above them creaked as the wind shifted. "I buried my father with one hand and packed with the other," he said at last. "I thought if I moved far enough I'd stop feeling hollow." Adeline set the brush down. "Did it work?" He looked at her then, full and steady. "No. It just made me miss you louder." She seemed to take that in, letting the quiet fill between them again. "I had a garden started by spring," she said, voice softer now. "It's mostly asters and beans, but it's mine. I don't want to leave it." "You won't have to," he said. "I'll build the fence higher and keep the deer out. You can show me which are weeds and which I shouldn't pull." She tilted her head, considering. "You know anything about planting?" He shook his head. "Just that you can't rush it. You tend it slow and you don't walk away when it's half grown." Adeline stepped forward, her hands still marked with mud and horsehair. "I don't want promises. I want proof you'll stay." He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small, worn horseshoe nail, bent into a circle. "I made this when I worked the line camp near Abilene," he said. "Kept it in my saddlebag since. Figured I'd know when to give it away." She took it from his palm, running her thumb over the cold metal. "It's not much. It's all I had." Her fingers closed around it, slow and certain. "Then I'll take it." Travis's shoulders eased, not with relief, but something deeper, like the part of himself that had waited years just exhaled. "I'll sleep in the bunkhouse tonight," he said. "You tell your ma your way." Adeline nodded. "She'll be up early." "She always is after a storm." He stepped back, pausing at the barn door. "You want me to bring the horse to pasture?" "No," she said, glancing toward the stall. "I'll walk him there." He opened the door and stepped into the cooling dusk. "Travis," she called after him. He turned. "I'm glad it was you," she said simply. He didn't answer, but the way he looked at her said more than words could. She watched him cross the yard, boots soft on wet earth, then turned back to the horse. Her hands moved steady over the brush again, but something inside her had shifted. The storm had passed, and for the first time in a long while the night ahead didn't feel like something to endure. It felt like the beginning of something worth keeping. By dawn, the clouds had scattered, leaving behind a brittle blue sky and the scent of wet sage rising off the hills. The Emery Ranch sat still in the early light, the cottonwoods along the creek line catching the sun on their last green leaves. Inside the kitchen, Adeline stood barefoot on the plank floor, sleeves rolled past her elbows, peeling potatoes into a basin. Her mother's steps creaked across the porch. "You planning to feed the whole territory?" Ruth Emery asked, pushing open the screen door with her shoulder as she carried in a bundle of kindling. Adeline didn't look up. Just felt like doing something with my hands. Ruth set the wood beside the stove and picked up a towel to dry her fingers. She didn't ask about the dress hanging over the wash line or the half-wilted bouquet left on the table. She only glanced once toward the bunkhouse through the window. "You don't owe me an explanation," she said after a moment. "I know, but I'll take one if you've got it." Adeline laid the knife down. "He came to the church after everyone else had gone, said he couldn't let me stand there alone." Ruth pulled out a chair and sat, her hands folded in her lap. "You believe him." "I do. You always did." Adeline looked over. "He's not the same as before." "No one is," Ruth said. "Not after years and not after loss." They sat with the quiet for a while, the stove ticking as it warmed. Outside, a horse stamped in the corral. "You planning to marry him now?" Ruth asked. "Yes." Ruth nodded once. "All right." Adeline's fingers tensed around the basin. "That's all you'll say? You thought I'd fight you. I thought you might ask me what changed." Ruth's gaze softened. "You did." "That's enough for me." Down at the bunkhouse, Travis stood at the pump, sleeves rolled, splashing cold water over his face. His pack lay near the door, still rolled. He hadn't unpacked, not yet. He turned when he heard boots in the gravel. "Coffee's hot," Ruth said. "Kitchen's open." He straightened. "Morning, ma'am." She gave him a long look. "Don't call me ma'am unless you mean to stay." He nodded once. "Yes, ma'am." She turned and walked back to the house without another word. Later, Adeline found him in the paddock, elbow deep in fence wire. He had pulled off his coat, and sweat darkened the collar of his shirt despite the cool. She leaned against the post and watched him twist the loop tight. "You could have let that be someone else's chore," she said. "You said the deer keep getting in." "I did." He looked up. "You think it'll hold?" "It's a start." She stepped forward, tugging a bit of wire straight. "What are you planning to do after the fence, after we're married?" He leaned on the post, eyes steady. "Stay here. Work the land with you. Build what I should have built years ago." "You ever worked cattle?" "Enough to know I'll need to learn better." She nodded. "You'll have to talk to Ezra about the north pasture. He's been helping us since Pa passed, and he's particular about the gates." "I'll talk to him," Travis said. "I've got no pride left that needs proving." Adeline looked down at her boots, nudging a stone from the dirt. "I kept your letters. Even the ones I didn't answer. I only ever stopped writing because I thought I'd said too much." "You hadn't." They stood quiet a moment, the wind tugging at her braid. "I was afraid if I wrote back, I'd wait for you every day," she said. "And I was afraid you'd say not to come back." He stepped closer, close enough she could see the old scar near his temple, the one he got when they were children and he'd fallen trying to climb the smokehouse roof. "You don't have to be afraid anymore," he said. She reached out, her fingers grazing his. "Then let's marry tomorrow," he nodded. "I'll ride into town tonight. Ask Reverend Carver if he'll come." Adeline tilted her head. "And if he won't?" "I'll ask until one says yes." She smiled, small but certain. "You always were stubborn." He took her hand, rough and warm. "Not always for the right things." She didn't pull away. "You are now." They stood there, hands clasped over the fence line while a hawk circled above and the pasture grass dried in the morning sun. The only things left between them were the kind that could be carried forward. And neither of them planned to leave anything behind. The sun was high over Elk Hollow when Travis returned from town, dust clinging to his boots and a folded scrap of paper tucked into his vest. He found Adeline near the barn, bent over a battered wooden crate, sorting spare hinges and gate latches by size. Her cheeks were flushed from the heat, strands of hair falling loose from her braid. She didn't look up when he approached, only spoke as the gravel shifted under his step. "What did he say?" "He'll be here before noon tomorrow," Travis said, crouching beside her. "Said he still had the sermon notes from your first date picked." She shook her head, lips twitching. I suppose that saves us the trouble of picking a new one. They worked in silence for a while, the only sound the scrape of metal against wood and the low hum of crickets. When the crate was nearly full, Adeline sat back on her heels and wiped her hands on the hem of her apron. He asked me once if I was marrying Dyer for comfort, she said, voice low. I told him I didn't know what comfort looked like anymore. Travis didn't answer right away. He picked up a rusted hinge and turned it between his fingers. Did you ever figure it out? I think so. She glanced sideways at him. It's not the kind that comes easy. He set the hinge down. No, but it's the kind that stays if you let it. She pushed to her feet slowly, brushing dirt from her skirt. I've got linens to wash. You want to help or hide? He stood without hesitation. I'll draw water. They walked together to the pump behind the cookhouse, Adeline carrying the basin, Travis with the bucket. She filled the tub while he worked the handle. Water splashed over the sides and soaked into the hard, packed earth, darkening it in wide patches. Did you ever think, she said, wringing out a sheet, that life would circle back like this? I didn't think I'd be lucky enough, he said, voice quiet. She glanced at him but didn't press. Later, after the linens had been hung and the sun had dipped low enough to soften the heat, they sat beneath the cottonwoods by the creek. The breeze stirred the leaves above them, and the water moved slow and shallow over stone. Adeline leaned back on her hands, boots crossed at the ankle. What's something you never told me? Travis considered. I used to sleep with my boots on. First year out in Kansas, couldn't shake the feeling something might go wrong in the night. She nodded once. Ezra did the same after Pa passed. Wouldn't admit it, but I saw the scuff marks on the floor come morning. He looked over. What about you? She picked up a twig and snapped it in half. I used to hum when I was scared, not always the same tune. Just something to fill the silence. You don't hum anymore, not for fear. The quiet between them settled deep and still. Travis drew in a breath. Do you want a big supper tomorrow after the vows or keep it plain? I'd like something simple. Bread, maybe. And pie if Ma's willing, he nodded. I'll bring the chairs from the bunkhouse. We can eat under the trees. Adeline reached over and took his hand, fingers cool against his skin. You don't have to keep proving yourself. I'm not, he said. I just want to do things right. She looked at him, steady. You already are. The sun slipped behind the ridge then, casting long shadows across the field. Crickets took up their song again, louder now, and a pair of doves settled in the branches above. Neither of them moved to leave. They stayed where they were, hand in hand, and watched the light fade from the sky like a promise kept. The next morning broke gold and mild, with dew clinging to the prairie grasses and a hush over the land that felt like a held breath. Adeline stood in the small upstairs room she'd shared with her sister before the war took her, the quilt folded back on the bed, and a square mirror propped on the sill. She pulled the ivory comb from her drawer, the one her father had carved from antler when she was 16, and worked it into the twist of her hair. The dress she wore today wasn't the one from 2 days before. That one had been hung and left. This one was simpler, cotton with a pale blue ribbon at the waist, and it had belonged to her mother once, back in the years when Ruth had come west with a man and 2 calves and no promise but the land. Downstairs, someone knocked lightly on the doorframe. Ezra stood there, hat in hand, his shirt collar pressed, boots polished with beeswax. You ready? He asked. She nodded, lifting the hem of her skirt just enough to step around the broom leaning against the wall. I suppose I am. He didn't offer his arm, he knew her too well for that, but he walked beside her to the cottonwood grove where the chairs had been set out, 6 of them borrowed from neighbors, 4 from the bunkhouse, and 2 from the kitchen. Ruth stood between the trees, a strand of ribbon tied to her wrist, watching the wind lift it as if it meant something. Reverend Carver stood waiting, Bible in hand, his spectacles fogged from the walk uphill. Travis was already there, his hair still damp at the temples, shirt collar stiff and hands still. She didn't rush. She let the moment stretch. When she reached him, he offered his hand, palm up, and she placed hers in it without hesitation. "You look right in the light," he said. "So do you." The Reverend cleared his throat, and those few gathered sat. Ruth, Ezra, the Nichols boy who brought milk down from the North Ridge, and June and Martha from the Mercantile. The rest had been invited quietly, but most hadn't come. That didn't matter. It felt full enough. The words passed like wind through grass, honest, simple, without flourish. When Travis looked at her and said, "I will," his voice didn't shake, and when Adeline said the same, her fingers tightened around his. There was no kiss called for in the Reverend's book, but Travis leaned forward anyway, slow and sure, and pressed his lips to her forehead. She closed her eyes, breathing in the scent of starch and saddle soap. Afterward, they ate under the trees. Ruth had made apple pie and corn pudding, and Ezra brought a jar of blackberry preserves that had been put up the summer before last. They passed tin plates and poured coffee from a blue enamel pot, and when the wind picked up, Adeline laid a hand on the edge of the tablecloth to keep it from lifting. Travis leaned in. "You ever think it'd be like this?" "No," she said. "But I like it better." As the sun dropped low, the guests began to rise and take their leave, Ruth packing leftovers into crocks, Ezra leading the Nichols boy back to the barn to check the calf he'd brought as a gift. Travis and Adeline stayed beneath the trees, the last light catching in her hair, in the lines of his jaw. "I've got an idea," he said, pushing his chair back and standing. She followed him as he led her past the edge of the grove, down to where the creek bent shallow over flat stones. He reached into the pocket of his vest and pulled out a folded paper, not the preacher's notes, but something else. "What's that?" "A deed," he said. "It's not much, but it's ours. 20 acres east of here. The land's dry, but there's a spring near the edge and the soil looks decent for beans." She took it from him, unfolding it carefully. Her thumb traced the scrawl of ink across the page. "You bought it. I traded for it. Horse work and fencing for the Miller brothers out near Rock Springs. Took me near a year." Adeline blinked once, then met his gaze. "You've had this ready?" "I never stopped hoping," he said. She folded the paper again and held it to her chest. "Then we'll build there." They stood together as the stars came out, scattered and soft across the darkening sky. He wrapped an arm around her waist and she leaned into him, the way you do when you're not bracing for anything anymore. They didn't speak again that night. They didn't need to. The wind moved through the grass, the creek ran steady, and the moon lifted clear over the ridge. In the weeks that followed, they worked side by side. He built the frame of a house with his own hands, and she planted rows of asters and pole beans by the door. Ruth came by on Sundays, bringing seed packets and bread, and Ezra helped run the fence line before dusk. There was no rush to finish. The pace was slow but sure, and every board nailed down was a promise kept. By winter, the house had walls and a stove, and Adeline hung curtains stitched from her mother's old flour sacks. Travis made a cradle from pine scraps, though there was no child yet, just the thought of one, sometime down the line. They filled the rooms with quiet and laughter, and a kind of peace that didn't come easy but stayed once it was found. They lived there all their days, side by side, through hard seasons and good ones, with the land beneath them and the sky above, and nothing left undone.